At one particular point in time, an upper class may be well organized and cohesive, and a lower class or a working class may be not cohesive and not well socially organized. When that happens, that upper class that is well organized tends to be very effective in getting governments in office that it favors and the kinds of policies passed that it likes. And the opposite is also true. If an upper class tends to be not cohesive and poorly socially organized, where a working class or a lower class is well organized and socially cohesive, then the working or lower class tends to be relatively successful in getting governments elected that support the left-wing policies that are in the interests of people who are in lower classes. Now, what do I mean when I say, and concretely, what does it mean to say that a group or a class is socially cohesive or socially organized? What does that look like? How does an upper class get organized? What does it do you think? Any ideas on this? Let's say that we, all of us, are executives, senior executives on the boards of directors of the largest Canadian corporations. And we're here today to figure out how we can get organized. What do you want to do? How are we going to do this? How are we going to get organized to influence government to pass policies that we like, that favor us? Any ideas? Create lobbying groups. What an interesting idea. What this woman wants us to do is somehow create an organization, one function of which at least will be to send representatives to Ottawa or to Queen's Park here in Ontario and to influence, to try to influence policymakers. Take them out to dinner or perhaps take them on a vacation and use the opportunity to explain to them why the policies that you and I favor as members of the corporate elite in this country are the best for the country as a whole. Okay, so yes, we can do that. That's a good idea. What else can we do? Sir? What a nice idea. We can contribute to individuals who are running for that political party or to the party itself in the hope that our contributions will win us some influence. It's nice to go by and say, you know what, we have all of these people who have a lot of money, and we can put it into your political party, and you can use that for advertising and so on. And of course, we expect something in return for that, a little bit of influence and so on. But you understand that, I don't have to say it. Okay, so yes, we can do that. What else can we do? Sorry? Yes, but how do we actually back up our interests, our ideas, with money? How do we do it concretely? I want ideas for organization here, yes. Brilliant idea. Let's run an ad campaign. Let's say that this group of people over here own oil and gas companies. They'll form an organization called Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, which is actually an organization that exists. And it consists of the executives of all of the major oil producers in the country. And then we'll run ads on TV. And the ads on TV will say things like, we're environmentally friendly. Right? We're doing, you've seen ads like that. It's all sponsored by the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Look at this. This used to be a mess here in the Alberta oil sands. And there were birds dying and people getting cancer from all of the chemicals in the water and in the air. But now, look, there are birds singing and there are trees growing. Aren't we wonderful? Right? And they will say, oh yes, here's another ad that they put out. All Canadians benefit from the oil sands. It's not just an Alberta project. This is a project that benefits everyone. Ontarians have to build the pipelines, and Quebecers have to build the pumps for the pipes that carry the oil. So it creates jobs right across the country. We support Canadian economic growth. We're not selfish Albertans, and we're not people who just want to line our own pockets, that is, the owners of the oil industry. So yes, a great idea. We'll establish a political or a media campaign. We can hire public relations firms to to do that for us, to put a nice spin on who we are and what we do. We can do a lot of things like that. And this kind of organization, of course, is not just restricted to the petroleum producers. We have another very important organization in Canada called the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. It represents the senior executives, that is, the chief executive officers, CEOs of the 150 biggest corporations in the country. And they do things like those that are mentioned. They also have established a couple of important think tanks. You know what a think tank is? It does contract research for whoever pays them. So, for example, there is this organization called the Fraser Institute in Vancouver, which is supported by business organizations in Canada, and they are putting out a constant stream of research which finds conclusively that low taxes are best for high growth, that oil producers are the most magnificent people in our society, and so on and so forth. And of course, many of these people have PhDs and so on in the think tanks, and it's very impressive. They put out glossy brochures. They can also provide press releases to the mass media. You know, reporters are very busy people. If they can get a news story made to measure, they don't even have to work on it, that's great. And therefore, in a fax machine in a typical news office, there's a constant stream of press releases coming out. And most of those press releases, which have news stories, are coming from big corporations saying, aren't we doing wonderful stuff? And many people in the media who don't want to bother doing their own research and their own reportage can simply rip it off the wire, and that's the news. It's another important way that we can use our resources to get organized. So yes, if we're very effective in that way, whereas people lower down in the class structure are not very effective, then we're going to have a lot of influence. We're going to be able to influence governments, we're going to be able to influence the population to vote in ways that we like. What about people lower down in the class structure? How do they get organized? We've transformed this. We're no longer an organization or a group of wealthy executives. Now we're just a bunch of ordinary workers, blue collar, white collar, whatever. What do? Unionize. Very important. We can unionize. What does that mean? Well, we can form an organization which will negotiate our wages, and in the event that employers will not meet our wage demands, we can withhold our labor. What's that called when they withhold their labor? It's called a strike. We can go on a strike. Okay? Not only that, but if we collect union dues, we can use some of that money to give to the political parties that support us. We're no different from the rich executive. We just support a different political party, right? So we'll use a portion of the union dues to support a left-wing party, which is why the labor movement in Canada is most closely aligned with the NDP. What happens is there's a money funnel that's going in that particular direction to support left-wing parties. Now, if we're organized, if we can get a large proportion of the population in our unions, and if we can take money from each union member in the form of a percentage of his or her dues and give it to a political party, that political party is going to act in the same way as the people on the right. It's going to organize think tanks. It's going to organize media campaigns. It's going to try to influence politicians and so on. And that's exactly what happens. So the key, power is not some mystery. Power derives from, among other things, from organization. Oh, here's a picture of what I mean. Power derives from organization. If you're organized, then you can accomplish a lot more than if you're not socially cohesive and if you're disorganized, right? And that's true for upper classes and it's true for lower classes. Now, here's an interesting, and by the way, this is not the only determinant of how powerful a group of people is, but it's certainly one important determinant of how powerful people are. Now, take a look at this graph, or this table, I should say. This shows you the effect of class organization on political policies 18 rich countries between 1946 and 1976. This summarizes 31 years of politics in Germany, Sweden, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Japan, all the rich countries. What does it say? Well, first of all, I've divided here these 18 countries into 3 groups on the left column here. There are 2 countries that are mainly socialist. They're on the left. Countries like Sweden, which have had, for the most part, pro-labor, left-wing governments in power in this period, 1946 to 76. Then, 7 partly socialist countries, like the United Kingdom, that have on occasion had labor governments in power, but not always. They've also had conservative or liberal governments in power. And then finally, 9 non-socialist countries, like Canada and the United States, that have never had a pro-labor party in power. The next column tells you the level of unionization in each of these 3 types of countries. And, not surprisingly, we find that where workers are most highly unionized, namely in these socialist countries, 68.5% of them, that's where the socialist parties tend to get elected. And where workers are least unionized, only 28% of the non-agricultural population in these bottom 9 countries, there you tend to have non-socialist governments. So working class power as measured by what's called union density, the percentage of non-agricultural workers who are unionized, is a very important determinant of the long-term political character of a country, whether it's left-wing or right-wing. Moving over to the third, 1, 2, 3, the 4th column, we see some of the effects of having a left-wing government or a right-wing government in power over time. The question here is, what percentage of national income goes to the 10% of wealthiest people in the country? And what you see is, starting from the bottom, 28.3% of all of the income earned in a country in a given year goes to the top 10% of income earners in these non-socialist countries. But as you go up, the percentage falls. By the time you get to the socialist countries, the top 10% are earning a smaller share. And the reason that they're earning a smaller share of total national income is because they're taxed more heavily as part of government policy. You see a very important effect here of having a left-wing or a right-wing government in power. And in the last column is the percentage of people who are poor in those countries, as defined by international bodies. There are standard definitions of what constitutes poverty, and the definition is comparable for each country. And what this says is that in these 9 non-socialist countries, almost 11% of people are poor over this period, on average. You move up a level to the 7 partly socialist countries at 7.8%, and then 4.3% for the non-socialists. So what you see here is a very clear demonstration of the fact that in the long term, the power of this particular class is manifested in union density. The percentage of workers who are organized in unions has a powerful effect on the distribution of income and the percentage of the population that is poor or not poor. Now, please remember, and that's all I'm going to say about normal politics for now. Please remember, in saying this, I'm not trying to say we can predict the outcome of the next election on the basis of this sort of thing. This table covers 31 years in 18 countries, okay? I'm talking about long-term trends here. For any particular election, other factors come into play in determining who wins. The state of the economy. The economy is in good shape. At the time of an election, that tends to favor the incumbent party, that is the party that's already forming the government. But people tend to get angry at the incumbent party if the economy is doing very poorly at the time of an election. So a bad economy is bad for an incumbent party, and the opposite is also is true as well. Another thing, simply the popularity of the politicians involved in leading the parties can have a big influence on the outcome of the party. There may be corruption scandals that have occurred recently that affect the popularity of different political parties. So I'm trying to distinguish here between short-term factors that will influence the outcome of any particular election and long-term factors like these, which have to do with class power, that influence the character of policy over the long haul, over many decades. Okay, so I've given you some reason to believe, I think, that Canadians, including young Canadians, are not bad or stupid for not being interested in politics. Rather, there's a perfectly rational reason for many people not to be interested in politics, electoral politics. And the reason is that many people believe that the government doesn't care about them, it doesn't matter, it's tilted in a particular direction, it doesn't really reflect their interests. That to me is a very rational reason. I know a lot of political scientists and political pundits like to dump on young people in particular for not voting or not caring. But as a sociologist, I see very clearly why people are irritated about the political system and don't care, when they think it doesn't matter. What's interesting, however, is that some people who are dissatisfied with politics vote with their feet. You know what that expression means? People vote with their feet. Or you can vote with your hand in a ballot box, or you can vote with your feet. It's an expression that was first used by Vladimir Lenin. You know who Lenin was? Not the Beatle. The guy who led the Russian Revolution. He said sometimes people are so dissatisfied they vote with their feet, by which he meant they go out into the streets, they riot, they demonstrate, they petition, they express their anger, their dissatisfaction by taking action. And that's certainly true in Canada as well. Sometimes people vote with their feet. That is to say, more academically, they form social movements, which are generally defined as collective attempts, that is, group attempts, to cause social and political change by striking, by demonstrating, by rioting, by petitioning, by forming new political parties, and so on. There are a variety of ways in which people can vote with their feet. And that's not the only form of non-normal politics that takes place. I'm going to talk about social movements in a minute. In addition, sometimes entire societies are so dissatisfied with their mode of existence that they and their governments will decide to engage in war with some other country or part of the country. That's also a form of politics. One famous British statesman said that war is simply diplomacy by other means. So we have diplomacy, which is nice talk, but then war, which tries to achieve the same thing by other means, by violent means. That's also a form of politics. Because in politics, it's the game of deciding who gets what, right? And how quickly they get it. And in playing that particular game, you can force the issue by stepping outside of normal politics and engaging in social movements and sometimes even in warfare. And I want to talk about those kinds of politics beyond the rules now. First of all, starting with social movements. And by the way, you will have a break. It will come at 2 p.m. I noted earlier that, sorry, there's a lot to do, I told you. I noted earlier that in all Western democracies, including Canada, there's a declining percentage of the electorate that's engaging in electoral politics. So the question, the empirical question, the question that we need evidence about, research-based evidence, is are we increasingly turning to non-electoral forms of politics in this country? And the answer is, yeah, it seems we are. Here's an interesting graph. This comes from something called the World Values Survey, which is conducted periodically, has been conducted periodically since 1981. We have 4 waves of this survey in Canada. 1981, 1990, 1999, 2000, 2006. And the same I mean, every survey, every edition of the World Values Survey asks a representative sample of Canadians and people in many, many other countries the same questions every so often, so we can know trends over time. It also asks them some different questions each year, but here I'm concentrating on questions concerning people's willingness to engage in non-conventional political action. People were asked, have you ever signed a petition? Have you ever engaged in a boycott? You know what a boycott is? Anybody not know? Where you say refuse to buy the product of a particular company because you believe the company is engaging in unethical practices? Or you want to boycott investment in a particular country because you believe that that country is doing something that is immoral? Those are boycotts, okay? So, have you ever boycotted? Have you ever engaged in a demonstration, an illegal strike? Or have you ever occupied private or public property illegally, a park, a building, anything like that? And this shows you the percentage of people who've done these various things in this country at 4 different times. And what the graph shows is that there isn't as much of a change in people's propensity to petition, boycott, or occupy, although that might have changed given the Occupy movement of a couple of years ago. This only goes up to 2006. We have another wave of the World Values Survey that has just been completed. Once the data are available, we may see a change in that. But there are statistically significant differences over time in the propensities of Canadians to engage in illegal strikes and to demonstrate. In other words, it does seem that while Canadians are decreasingly interested in electoral politics, some Canadians are increasingly interested in voting with their feet, at least in these 2 different ways, engaging in demonstrations and in illegal strikes. So, the question is, what counts for people's willingness on some occasions, but not on others, to take collective action, to say, I've had enough, I'm not going to take it anymore. You feel the same, let's do something about it. If it means we have to step outside the bounds of normal electoral politics, let's do it. When do you think, what kind of circumstance might encourage people to do that? Anyone? Hunger. Which is why, of course, the greatest uprisings in the world occur where people are starving. Is that true? Yes. Is it? I mean, you occasionally at least watch the news. Is that true? That it's in famine conditions where people are most rebellious? Sometimes, but not that often. Because usually when you don't have enough food, you're too weak to fight. Or you're too busy spending time and energy trying to get enough for your family to eat. You don't have time to think about politics. Sir? Pardon me? Austerity? So that's an interesting idea, because what you're saying, austerity means, you know, like cutting back on one's consumption of various things, having less. So what you're suggesting, if I may extrapolate a little bit from it, is that people may be used to a certain level of affluence at a particular time. But if they have to cut back on what they're used to, if they expect to live at a certain standard of living, but then the reality falls below their expectations, a lot below, then they may be prepared to rebel. Am I going too far? I think we agree on. Okay. So, we have here already 2 different points of view. The first idea, hunger, was an argument about what sociologists and political scientists call absolute deprivation. The worse off you are, the more likely you are to rebel, to take action to form a social movement. The second idea is based on the notion of relative deprivation. It's not absolutely how much you're suffering, how hungry, how poor, and so on you are. Because usually the most destitute people do not rebel, do not engage in collective action. Rather, it's how relatively, your perception of how well off you are compared to what you expect to get out of life. It's an interesting idea. In fact, until 1970, that idea of relative deprivation was more or less orthodoxy in the social sciences. People believed that rebellion of various sorts occurred when this condition existed. Look at this graph. This is called relative deprivation. See that red line? That's the level of reward that people expect. The amount of money they expect out of life, the amount of education they expect to receive, the food they expect to eat, and so on. And the idea is that you may be bopping along, enjoying life just fine. There may be a period of prosperity when things are going along famously. However, at a certain juncture, the actual rewards that you receive in education, in dollars and cents, in self-esteem, in whatever, food, whatever, it may decline. There may be what this gentleman referred to as a period of austerity. There may be a terrible economic depression suddenly. Or there may be a war that breaks out over an extended period of time. And suddenly, the rewards you receive plummet, while your expectations were still sky high. Rebellion happens, say the relative deprivation theorists, when an intolerable gap opens up between expected rewards and received rewards. So it's a more sophisticated view than the first one, which is hunger, deprivation, in an absolute sense causes people to rebel. But you know, I mentioned, for those of you who were paying attention, that this was orthodoxy until about 1970. Because around 1970, sociologists and political scientists started doing some actual research on this subject. In particular, there was a fellow who spent a short time here at the University of Toronto, a couple of years, and spent a lot of time at the University of Michigan and later at Harvard, who did these enormous studies with an entire team of other political sociologists who studied the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, and Italy throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century. And what they did was they tried to measure that gap in the population. They did that by a very extensive, painstaking analysis of newspapers from each of these countries for like 150 years. And they would try to figure out the different regions of the countries as a whole how relatively deprived people felt. And they also measured various forms of rebellion, strikes, demonstrations, riots, and so on. They counted up how many people were in the streets over time. And what they found was nothing. They found out the correlation between relative deprivation, as they measured it, and the propensity to rebel. The correlation was close to zero. There was no such relationship. And so a revision began in the study of social movements. If it's not absolute deprivation, that is the level of absolute poverty and misery that people feel that encourages them to rebel. And if these studies of the major Western liberal democracies, France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, and the United States, show that over a 150-year period, there is really almost no correlation whatsoever between the experience of relative deprivation on the part of the national population and the propensity of that population to go out onto the streets and demonstrate and riot and so on. Where are we? Well, a new set of ideas was proposed beginning around the mid-1970s, had a lot of influence. It was called resource mobilization theory. And resource mobilization theory is similar to what I was arguing before about electoral politics. It says that social movements emerge, people vote with their feet, only when disadvantaged people who feel that there is injustice, can marshal the means necessary to challenge authority. It's the means, the resources that are needed in order to get people to rebel. In other words, what the resource mobilization theorists were saying was, you know what, in any society, at any point in time, there's going to be quite a lot of discontent. People are going to be dissatisfied with their lot in life. The real question is, when do the people who are dissatisfied with their lot in life have the means to do something about it, to translate their anger, their dissatisfaction into action? That only happens sometimes. And that's what we have to study, how resources are distributed and redistributed so that under some occasions people can rebel and under other occasions they don't. Organization is one of the most important determinants, or one of the most important resources that people can possess.